If I say to you 9/11, what do you think about? What if I say nuclear attack drill? Some of y'all, what does that mean? Dennis, did you ever have to get under a desk in case the Russians were going to bomb? Did you ever do that? Okay. They were like, man, desk isn't going to help. You know, people that had to do stuff like that. I've had actually a couple of conversations about this in the last couple of weeks. Jake and I talked about it this past week about the way that different generations respond to the things that happened in their formative years. And how, once that happens, you're constantly looking for it. So I was in 10th grade when 9/11 happened. Actually, I remember when the towers hit. Derek, Brittany, and I were all in a choir class together whenever everything went down. I remember being in that room, and I can remember it happening. I could feel the feeling that was in my gut all day. I remember exactly what that feels like. I can remember watching the news. I remember Peter Jennings. I spent the whole day with Peter Jennings because I was living with Mom, and she was at school dealing with kids, and the school buses ran only, so I was home alone. So it was just me and Peter Jennings, and sitting there watching that, and I remember that feeling. And so when you say 9/11, some people are able to say it pretty casually, but for me, it all comes back pretty quickly. And I think it's the same thing with the generation that's coming up right now when you start talking about COVID, because they were just at school. Like for all of us, it was a big deal, but they were just at school. It's formative years. We're going to take a couple of weeks off, and then we'll come back, and then all of a sudden it's 6 months. And so I think the reason this came up for Jake and I was he had heard about monkeypox coming through. Like for me, you'd say monkeypox coming, not a big deal, because I remember the swine flu, and I remember avian flu, and I remember all these things that were going to come. And so it was just one out of many, but for that generation, this was their first one. And so anytime for the rest of their lives they hear that, that's what they're going to think about. We have these things that to us, you can just say a phrase and it packs a whole lot of meaning behind it. And to other people, there's no meaning behind it whatsoever. We can't, every time we say 9/11, I can't unpack what that was like and what it felt like for me as somebody that lived a long way away but still watching it on TV. I can't unpack that, so we just wrap it up in this phrase, 9/11, or remember 9/11, or we wrap it up in the phrase COVID, or we wrap it up in the Red Scare, or whatever it was that you lived through that was your thing that you look back at. And this is the thing that even when you say it, it still carries a lot of emotion for you. We can't just unpack that every time, so we encapsulate it. But the problem with encapsulating it in just a phrase is it loses its meaning to people who weren't there and didn't experience it, right? I can say, Britt and I dated for 3 years before we got married. That's true. But there was a lot that happened in that 3 years. Those words encapsulate a lot. And for somebody that didn't live it, you can just say that. And it's just, it's something that happened. It was 3 years. And we encapsulate in order to get through the conversation, long story short. But when we encapsulate, we can make the mistake of minimizing. And when I say the phrase, Jesus died on the cross, you all agree with that, you all understand what that means. But it's really easy to minimize that to Jesus died on the cross, and not the fact that it's this ordeal that lasted more than a day that he went through, a day and a half that he went through, that culminated with 6 hours hanging on a cross. We say Jesus died on the cross, and we all get that, but we encapsulate it, and because we encapsulate it, we kind of minimize it. And I think it's important every once in a while to just kind of go through and open up that capsule and look at all the stuff that's inside it and understand what it means that Jesus was on the cross, that Jesus died on the cross. And so today, as we're getting very close to the end of Mark, I just kind of want to take you through all of what the Gospels say about it, focusing specifically on what Mark had to say about it. And hopefully our slides will cooperate and everything will be good. But just in case it doesn't, we're in Mark chapter 15. So if you got your Bible, you got your phone, you can go over there in Mark chapter 15, and we'll hope that technology cooperates with us today. We're going to pick up right at the tail end of where we finished last week, which was the 6 trials of Jesus. We're going to pick up right there in Mark chapter 15, starting in verse 15. It says, "So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, And having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. I don't want to re-preach last week, but Barabbas was a hated man. Okay, he was a revolutionary, but he wasn't a Robin Hood kind of revolutionary. He was the kind of revolutionary that took everything for himself, that he killed innocent people, he burned stuff down, he brought lots of punishment on these people. They hated him, but because of the way that things were positioned, they chose to release him rather than Jesus. And what they asked for that, and so Pilate, who's a political person, who's, it is what it is. I don't really want to do this, but this is what I'm going to go ahead and do. He scourged Jesus. I talked to you last week about a scourge. It's called a cat of nine tails. It's got leather straps on it that are, how long is it? 18 inches, that are about that long. And at the end of them, they would have tied pieces of metal or pieces of rock. Throughout the bands, they would put in pieces of metal, pieces of bone, things like that. And the goal was for whenever you hit somebody, for those pieces of metal at the end to be like a punch in the back, a bunch of punches in the back. And then all the metal pieces and bone and things like that would rip the skin. And so they would beat them somewhere around 40 times, depending on what the number of lashes they were given was. And what this would do, it's like being punched in the back a bunch of different times over and over again, but it also has the skin ripped off your back so that by the time you're done, you're just a bloody mess. It's not that the skin is hanging off, the skin is just gone, and it's a bloody mess on your back. So they would have taken his clothes off, they would have stripped him so they wouldn't ruin the clothes, and then they scourge him, and this is before it even starts. And what you got to remember is this is not the beginning of the day. He didn't get a good night's rest and then wake up for this. He's been up since the morning before. They had the Passover that night, which is a long meal that he spent. He washed the disciples' feet. It's been all day. He stays up till past midnight in the garden, crying blood. They're so tired the disciples can't stay awake for him, right? They keep going to sleep. But he endures and is praying in the garden, weeping, begging, if there's another way, then please, God, let there be another way. But if not, then your will be done. He does this all night. Then he's arrested. He's taken to 6 different locations as he's tried. He's beaten. He's mocked all night long. And we're really close to morning right now. Okay, we're actually in the morning right now, really close, somewhere close to 9 o'clock, because he's going to be on the cross by 9 a.m. So he's been up, and now he's just been beaten with a severe beating, and then it's after that they turn him over to be crucified. And the Roman soldiers take him, and in verse 16, they lead him away inside the palace. That's the governor's headquarters. Maybe your Bible says the Praetorium. This is the main headquarters for Rome in that place. And they called together the whole battalion. And they clothed him in a purple cloak and twisted together a crown of thorns. They put him on him. And what you got to understand about the Romans is, especially the Roman soldiers, is they hated the Jews because they did not want to be there. This is an armpit location for the Romans. Like, where do you want to be? Do you want to be on the Mediterranean where you're there guarding some beautiful villa and you're there with people that you live around and you understand and the culture's the same? Do you want to be off in Spain fighting people and stealing all their wealth after you defeat them? Or do you want to be assigned to a place where the people hate you, where it's hot, where nobody wants you there and you don't want to be there and the culture's different? And that, not only that, but they think you're so dirty that they won't even be in the same building with you. They won't eat with you. Where do you think the dream assignment is for a Roman soldier? It's not Jerusalem. In a place where there is constant threat of rebellion, where they are constantly worried that they're going to be knifed. If they walk down an alley by themselves, they're going to be killed. Where they can't go out and get all the money that they're able to do. If they're able to go out and fight people, they're just there on guard duty. They don't want to be there. The Jews don't want them there. It's tension and hatred back and forth. And now the Romans have an opportunity to humiliate someone that they recognize as the leader of the Jews. So they take him and they go where they call everybody in because they want to make this a spectacle. They call the entire battalion in. They have them line up in ranks, and then they put a purple cloak on him, and they take some thorns from off the side of the road, they twist them together into a crown, and they shove it down on his head so he's bleeding. Now, this is mockery, and the thorns would hurt, but I don't know that he even feels the thorns. Because if you ever had a scrape, you had a bloody spot, and you got some cloth stuck to it, his whole back is raw. His whole back is raw. And they lay this cape over his back, this cloak over his back, and it just immediately soaks in against the skin. And you don't even, I mean, I don't know that I would feel anything else. The pain of that. They shoved this crown on him, and then they began to salute him. Hail, King of the Jews. One of the other Gospels tell us that they didn't just put a robe on him and put a crown on him, but they gave him a scepter, a reed scepter. And then they took the scepter from him. And they began to hit him in the head with a reed and spit on him. And would alternate between spitting on him, hitting him in the head, and kneeling in mockery to him. And when they were finished mocking him in verse 20, they stripped off the purple cloak. And this is going to be a rough day, so just prepare yourself for this. They take that cloak and they pull it off of him. And you just imagine what that feels like, pulling it raw back, and the blood is soaked in, and it's on this cloak, and they pull it off. Just what that feels like, the agony of that. They pull it on him, and then they put clothes back on him, which stick again. And then they lead him out to crucify him. As they're taking him out to crucify him, Jesus is collapsing under his own weight. They put the cross on him to carry him, because that's what they generally did. Now, they don't do the whole cross like you see these people walking around malls and stuff, and they're carrying the whole cross. That's not what they did, because the Romans didn't want to have to haul that around themselves. So what they would do is they would take the crossbar, just the horizontal piece, and they would make them carry it through the street as evidence to everybody about what was about to happen. But they're having Jesus carry this, and he collapses. And you know, if you don't look at the details of this, you say, why is Jesus not able to carry his cross? He's a strong carpenter. He's the Son of God. Like, why is he not able to carry this? And if you think about what he's gone through and what his back is like, it's no wonder he can't carry it. He collapses under its weight, and they grab a guy. Now, my slides are all messed up here, but in verse 21, what we're told is that they grab a guy named Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, and they have him carry the cross. Now, I don't know if you catch this. I'm an Easter egg guy, right? I like if there's Easter eggs in something, I'm going to just search it out to figure it out. All the Marvel stuff, all those different things. I love Easter eggs. And so I'm looking for Easter eggs in the Bible, and I think we've got an Easter egg right here. It's really strange that he is identified by his sons, because that's not how you identify people. You identify people by their father, right? So you identify people by their father, not their son. So why are Alexander and Rufus referenced? Well, the reason that Alexander and Rufus are referenced is because Alexander and Rufus, most likely at the time that this was written, were active parts of the church. In fact, when Paul writes Romans, he thanks a bunch of people, and one of the people that he thanks is a guy named Rufus. He said, I want to thank Rufus and his mother, because she has been like a mother to me, and they have cared for me in my ministry. So why does Mark go out of his way to say Simon of Cyrene? Not just we grabbed a guy, or not just we grabbed Simon of Cyrene, but we grabbed Simon of Cyrene, son of Rufus and Alexander. Why does he do that? Because they knew who Rufus and Alexander were. Can you imagine what that's like? To be Simon of Cyrene, being at a church service and saying, I carried Jesus' cross. Or Rufus being in Rome and sharing the gospel with somebody and say, how do you know all this is real? How do you know this is real? How do you know this is true? He said, well, I was there. My dad took me into town, and we were there for Passover. We lived over in Libya, but we came over to Jerusalem for the Passover while we were there. And while we were there watching, we see this guy coming through, and he collapses under the weight of this crossbeam. And so they reach out and grab my dad, and they pull him in. And I know that what happened with Jesus is real because I watched my dad carry that cross, and I was there, and I saw. It's a whole Ray Bolt's Watch the Lamb kind of moment. Daddy, daddy, you know. And it's a kind of a niche joke there. Nobody got it. He watches him do this, and he tells a story. So Simon brings the cross in. Jesus is brought to this place, and we get to verse 22. They brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull. And it's a giant bluff in the middle of town. that looks like a skull. You can see the face of the skull. It's still there today. You can Google Golgotha and see the place of the skull. And it's such a big rock that they couldn't move it. So the streets just kind of made a crossroads around it. And they would put the prisoners, they would put all the crosses up there so that everybody going through town around this rock would see them as they went through. So they bring Jesus and they bring him up this rock to this called Golgotha. And before they put him up on the cross, they offer him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And that seems like kind of a throwaway thing, but this was a thing that they would offer to those who were about to be crucified that they felt a little bit bad for. There are some people that you crucify and you're like, man, I'm glad that guy's up there. And there's some people you crucify, a political prisoner or whatever, that you don't, maybe somebody has some sympathy for. Maybe this was Pilate that ordered, but myrrh is an analgesic. It's a pain reliever. And so they would offer them wine with this pain reliever, and it tasted awful, super bitter. But they would give it to them to relieve a little bit of the pain. And this is to give a little bit of mercy, but it's also so that they would last longer on the cross. And so they give them to this. And Jesus, when offered an opportunity to relieve his pain, said no. Then they crucified him. And what we're told is that they crucified him because they could do it two different ways. Some places they would just tie them up. They would tie their hands and feet up. You would generally do this whenever you're coming into conquer a place. Like maybe you've heard the stories about the mile of people that were crucified just along the road, just as a representation of what had happened. They would do that when they wanted them to last a little bit longer, but for people who were actually being punished for a crime, and especially in this region, what they would do is they would nail through the wrist on both sides, hold them up. They didn't do, it says hands, but that's really just it's a language thing. They would put in the wrist because that would be the spot that would actually hold. If you put it through the hand, it'll rip through the meat of the hand. And then they would nail them on with their feet. And so what they would do is they would have the big pole set up already there because the soldiers don't want to carry it back and forth. And they would take the pole and they would lean it down and they would nail the hands of the prisoner to the beam and probably tie it too, but they would nail it on. And then they would nail the cross beam to the post, and then they would use ropes to pull the post up. It would sit in a hole, and they would use ropes to pull it up and set it. And the jarring of the pole setting down is just excruciating. So they do this to Jesus. They put nails in his wrists. They put nails in his feet. They've stripped him of all of his clothes, so he's hanging there. I mean, the pictures have him in underwear. Probably not, because they took all his clothes. And they have him hanging there, and then you got the back pain of the ripped flesh, you've got the pain in your hands and your feet, you've got the jolt and the jarring up there. He rejected the pain medicine that could have come for them. And meanwhile, after they put him up there, it says that the soldiers divided his clothes. This is not really that surprising. It's pretty standard. Maybe you've read about that. The executioner always gets the prisoner's boots. That's the kind of thing. They would divide up the clothes because clothes were valuable. But the reason that it calls it out is because in Psalm 22, there's a reference to the fact that the Messiah would have his clothes divided. And not just divided, but they would cast lots. They would throw dice to see who would get them. And the reason they had to do that is because he was wearing 5 pieces of clothes and there were 4 soldiers. He was wearing an especially nice undergarment made of 1 piece. And so they divided up whatever the 4 pieces were, and then they took dice and they threw dice to see who would get the nicest piece. And we say this, and we mention this, not because it's unusual that it happened, but because the way it happens fulfills the prophecy about the Messiah. And it was the 3rd hour when they crucified him. That's the 3rd hour after sunrise. So it's 9 a.m., about 9 a.m., when they put him on the cross. And Pilate ordered that they put a sign above him. And on the sign it said, "The King of the Jews." And the high priest said, no, take that down and write that it says he said he was the King of the Jews. And Pilate said, no, I've written what I've written. I've put this up here as an act of humiliation against your nation, that I could do this to the one that you believe bad enough as your king that you're willing to do this. and you can't do anything to stop me. But also to expose why it is that you said this. Because just a week ago, there was a parade through this town where all the people of Israel acclaimed, this is the Messiah. This is the Son of David. And today you put him on a cross. So I'm going to expose your hypocrisy. And he writes above him, the King of the Jews. And this is not just Jesus-only crucifixion, but this is a normal crucifixion day where they crucify people, which they had to do all the time. So it's not just Jesus on the cross this day, but it's Jesus with at least two other people, one on each side. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, aha. I don't know what the Greek word for aha is. I should have looked that up. Aha, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross. If you remember, Jesus said something similar to this, but he did not say this. That was an accusation made against him. That he said he would destroy the temple and he would rebuild it himself in 3 days. But what he said is, you can kill me, this temple will be destroyed, but I will be raised in 3 days. He never claimed to be able to do that. But that was what they mocked him with. That's what they told everybody he said. He's a liar. He said he would do this, and they mocked him. He said, save yourself. Come down for the cross. So also the chief priests and the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, he saved others, but he cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe. And those who were crucified with him also reviled him. If it brings you any comfort, I doubt that he was paying any attention to that. Because if I'm that miserable, I don't hear anything anybody's saying. I'm focused entirely on the pain. But I think he was aware of what was going on, because it's at this point, and Mark doesn't tell us this, Luke tells us this, I think it's Luke tells us this, that Jesus says this. He says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And I think that's significant because it reminds me of Moses' interactions with God, right? The Israelites would sin against God, and God would say, I'm getting out. Y'all made me get out of my chair. Y'all made me get out of my chair. I'm getting out of my chair. I'm about to burn this sucker down, and I'm starting over with you, Moses. They don't deserve it. They don't deserve me. I just brought them out. I just rescued them, and now they're complaining about everything. I'm going to destroy them. And Moses would stand in between them and God and say, hold on, hold on. Think of how this will look. Think of what this will be like. This is not who you are. Show mercy. And God would show mercy over and over. And this is me. This is entirely me. This is not in Scripture. This is just what it looks like to me. What it looks like to me is Jesus has wept tears of blood and said, Father, if there's any other way. And the Father said, there's no other way. There's no other way. You have to go and do this. And Jesus is doing it. And the Father is not thrilled about this. He's angry about this. And then Jesus is on the cross. He's going to endure it. And while he's doing it, these people who are supposed to be his representatives to the people there, the ones that stand in between them and God, to say mercy, 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 instead are mocking him. And it's like God saying, I'm getting out of my chair. You did it. I'm getting out of my chair. I'm going to burn this thing down. And Jesus says in his act of mediation, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Father, forgive them. Meanwhile, on the cross, Jesus doesn't say a whole lot. But he says a few things. And one of the things that's significant that he says happens as a conversation on either side of him. One of the thieves on the cross joins in with a mockery. I said, free, you're the Messiah. Free both of us. Free all of us. You can do this. Take us down off this cross. We'll join up with you. Take us off this cross. If you are who you say you are. And in Luke 23, verse 40, we're going to jump over to Luke for just a second. The other rebuked him, saying, do you not fear God? Since you are under the same sentence of condemnation. And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. And he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus, in one of the very few things that he says while on the cross, says to this thief, this man who was not religious, this man who didn't go to church, this man who probably couldn't have told you anything about the Bible, this man who has spent his life in crime and in sin, who recognizes at the last moment what he has done and who Jesus is. He says to him, truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. And the thing is that the thief would stay on that cross. Eventually, the soldiers would come along and they would break his legs. The reason you break the legs is because when you're hanging like this, you don't have any leverage to breathe. Okay? So most people die from crucifixion. They don't die from blood loss. They don't die from the trauma. They suffocate. Because the way the body is scrunched, you can't get a good breath. So to get a good breath, you have to push up on your feet, which are nailed to a piece of board. You have to push up on the nail to be able to get enough room to get a breath. And so you spend the entire time that you're on the cross trying not to breathe and then trying to breathe. And trying not to breathe and then trying to breathe. And there will come a point while this man who will be in heaven with us, when the soldiers come and they break his legs so he won't be able to breathe anymore. And he would run out of breath, and his eyes would close, and they would open again in eternity in heaven. Not because he was a good man, not because he went to church, not because he was a follower of Jesus, but because he did the same thing that we are called to do. He recognized his own sin. He said, we deserve to be up here. He doesn't. He recognized that he was a sinner. He recognized that Jesus was not. And he said, he is innocent. He does not deserve to be up here with us. And he said, Lord, I believe you can rescue me, and I ask that you would. See, we know that the way that a person enters into a relationship with God, the way that they're saved, is by doing three things. It's by recognizing that you're a sinner in desperate need of rescue, by recognizing that he is the only Son of God who is sinless and the only one who can rescue, and by crying out to him and saying, Lord, rescue me. He did the same thing that we are called to do. And regardless of his behavior, he was in the middle of capital punishment, guys. Regardless of his behavior previously, regardless of how he spent the rest of his life, he was saved and was in eternity with Jesus that day. Because he looked at Jesus and he looked at himself and said, I can't do this, but you can. Please do. And Jesus lifted himself up on those nailed feet to get a breath. To say, truly I say to you today, you will be with me in paradise. Jesus hung on that cross and he really didn't say much. And then at the 6th hour, which is noon, the sky goes black. Mark 15:33, when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. From noon to 3, it's dark. And the mockery tails off a little bit. When these people who put Jesus on the cross, who are mocking him for his inability to get down, see that God steps in and steps in between them and the sun. It calms down a little. They start to rethink what they've done just a little bit. The sky going black is a pretty ominous sign. And staying black until 3 o'clock is a big deal. And then at the 9th hour, which is 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Don't look it up. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? We're going to come back to that in just a second. Some bystanders, verse 35, some of the bystanders hearing it said, behold, he's calling Elijah. So suddenly, all of a sudden, when the sky goes black, they start rethinking what they're doing. And when he starts yelling in, they're like, oh boy, we might have messed up here. Maybe he's calling Elijah to come and rescue him. This prophet, the one that was taken by fire, maybe he's calling him to come and take him off the cross. If he comes off that cross, I want to be on his good side. So what he does is he runs over and he grabs one of the soldiers' canteens and he pours it on a sponge. And he puts it on a stick and he hands it up to him saying, hey, by the way, if you come off of there and start swinging, remember, I was the one that gave you something to drink. This water mixed with vinegar, this sour wine is what it is. It's just a cheap drink is all it is. But you don't want to drink the water because you'll get sick if you drink the water. So the rich people would drink wine and water. And then would just drink regular wine, whatever it was. But the poor people would drink vinegar in their water. So like take some apple cider vinegar and put it in there, maybe put some fruit or something in it. This is just a common person's drink that would purify the water, but also give it a little flavor. So they're not insulting him by giving him this, but they put it on that and they hand it up to him. Saying, well, let's see whether Elijah's come to take him down. And then Jesus utters a loud cry. And we're told in the other Gospels what it is. Mark just says he yells at the very end. The other Gospel writers tell us that he said two things. He said, it is finished, and into thy hands I commend my spirit. That he yells. He lifts himself up on his feet because it's over. And he yells, it's finished. I'm done. Take me, because I'm done. And he dies. Now, he doesn't just die naturally. He doesn't die of natural causes. In fact, this is backed up in a couple of different places that he didn't die of natural causes, that he didn't succumb to his injuries. First of all, when they go to tell Pilate, and Pilate, Joseph of Arimathea, goes to take the body off the cross, he goes to Pilate and says, can I take the body off the cross? And he said, he's dead already? Because it takes longer than that to die from this. Jesus died unnaturally quickly. But also, in just a minute in verse 39, the centurion who stood facing him saw the way he breathed his life. When he saw the way he died, he said, oh, he was right. Truly, this man was the Son of God. The people there recognized, people who crucified people regularly and knew how this died, recognized that even his death was unusual. So he was right. We're told that he didn't succumb to his injuries, but he gave up the ghost. He dismissed his own life. Because the punishment for sin is death, and death does not come without sin. And Jesus, not having sinned, could not be taken by death, but rather had to surrender to death and give himself up. And when that happened, there's a few things that happened. Verse 38 says the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. What that means, that doesn't really mean anything to us, but there's three things that happen, major things that happen when Jesus takes that last breath. The big thing is there's an earthquake, which should tell you something. There's an earthquake. And when the earthquake happens, the veil is torn. Now, in the temple, there's a spot called the Holy of Holies where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, that only the high priest went once a year. This is where they met with the presence of God. There was a big curtain that separated everybody. It's 30 feet wide and 60 feet tall and 4 inches thick. The wind doesn't blow it. You have to have help moving it to get in. But when that earthquake comes, the veil is ripped from top to bottom. Because before, you could not enter the presence of God. But now the presence of God is available to anyone through Jesus. And not only that, but when Jesus' life ended, it was such a powerful thing that many people came back to life. Many believers were raised and went through the city telling everyone what had happened. And Jesus breathed his life last. The light comes back on. In verse 40, it says, there were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, the younger, and of Joseph and Salome. Salome, however you want to say that. And when he was in Galilee, they followed him and ministered to him, and there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. Why? There's nothing helpful here, right? Why is this here? Why do they say the women were there? I just want you to think about who else was there. Peter was there for a little bit, and then he ran off. John has been in and out, and he's there long enough for Jesus to say, hey, this is your mom now, take care of her, and they leave. But do you know who was with him the entire time that he was on the cross? The women. The men, pretty unreliable. The men were in and out. But in a time where women were not valued, the women that were thought of less than, the women understood what was needed of them in a way that the men did not. There was no way they could get him off that cross. There was no way that they could comfort him, but what they could do was be present. And when Mark writes this, he's going to say, men weren't there, but the women were. And in a time where the churches, the first churches are wrestling, what is the role of women? How valuable are women in a church? Mark says, I just want to point something out about the cross of Jesus and who was there. These women who were there ministering to Jesus, taking care of, they weren't preaching. They weren't out leading all this stuff. They were taking care of Jesus. They never left him. They were there caring for him. So before you start putting the women out of the congregation or separating them out, understand that they were there. Let's jump back. We'll talk next week about the burial and the crucifixion, and we'll be done with Mark. But let's jump back for just a minute to Mark chapter 15, verse 34. It says, at the ninth hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And I have been told something my entire life that I don't believe is true. What I've been told is, and you've been told this too, is that when the entire weight of the sin of all humanity was placed on Jesus, that the Father could not bear to look at him because of that sin. And the Father turned his face from him, and Jesus cried out in agony at the absence of his Father. And let me tell you something. There is no verse in the Bible that says that's what happened. There is no point where that says that happened. God was able to look at David and his sin. He's able to look at Abraham and his sin. He's able to look at King Saul and his sin, but suddenly he can't look at Jesus and his sin. Why do we think that? Because we don't understand what this verse means. Well, let me tell you what this verse means. Did you know that we don't use the correct names or the original names for the Old Testament books? The Old Testament, the book of Genesis, that's a Greek word. It was come up with when they translated into Greek. The original name in Hebrew for Genesis is Bereshit, which means in the beginning. All these books are named after their opening lines, and the same with the Psalms. They're named after their opening lines. Do you want to know what the opening line of Psalm 22 is? My God, why have you forsaken me? Let me read Psalm 22. I'm not going to read all of it because it's long and we're late. Let me just read just a few portions of it. Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. Does that sound familiar? My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death, for dogs encompass me. A company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. You who fear Jacob, praise him. All you offspring of Jacob, glorify him and stand in awe of him. All of you offspring of Israel. David is in this lament, and he says he feels like he's been abandoned by God. He says all these things about how he feels like God's abandoned him. But halfway through the psalm, he realizes he has not been abandoned. But the thing is, he lists all these poetic things about his abandonment, about having nails in his hands and his feet, which is a weird metaphor if you don't have nails in your hands and your feet, about being so thirsty that it's like his mouth is just completely dry like an old piece of clay, about how they're gambling for his clothing, which David didn't experience. So what we know is that David wrote all these things about a psalm about feeling abandoned by God, But throughout it, he gives prophecy after prophecy after prophecy about what Jesus would experience on the cross. And then halfway through the psalm, he flips and he recognizes that God has not abandoned him. He said, praise God, everyone who recognizes him, for he has not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, and he has not what? Hidden his face from him. Even David, who said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" recognized that God had not turned his back on him, had not abandoned him, had not looked away from him. But he said, even though it felt like it because of what I was going through, he never left me. But he has heard when I cried to him. And this is how he wraps everything up in verse 27. All the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord. All the families of the nation shall worship before you, for kingship belongs to the Lord, and he rules over all the nations. All the prosperous of the earth eat and worship before him shall bow down. All who go down to the dust, as every single person will worship, even the one who could not keep himself alive. And here's verse 30, okay? Posterity shall serve him. Posterity, those who are to come after, this is us. Posterity shall serve him. And be told to the of the Lord, to the coming generations, all those who come after. What will they be told? They will come and proclaim his righteousness to a people yet unborn, that he has done it. So Jesus is on the cross and he cries out, Psalm 22. And then he dies. I said, Psalm 22? That's weird. So what do? Start singing through Psalm 22 in their heads, because they know all these songs. They start singing through Psalm 22 in their head. My God, why have you forsaken me? That seems right. All right? Hands and feet, casting lots, mouth all dried up, surrounded by people being mocked, saying the literal words we were just saying. But the end of that is worship and recognition that although it seemed like God had abandoned him, this was exactly the plan. And everyone will be told for the rest of history that God is faithful and he has done what he chose to do and has accomplished. God did not turn his face from him. And don't you say he did. God was with him the entire time. And though it might have looked like he was abandoned, the Father was with him, and it will be told to generations yet unborn that he has done it. He has defeated death, and he has made a way of salvation for all those who will trust in him. And Jesus raises himself up on the nail in his feet to get a good enough breath to say, I won, you lost. And it will be told to every generation to come what I have done. Jesus died on the cross. Yes, he did. But it was a miserable experience. It was hours of agony that he allowed himself to endure. He rejected relief. He rejected pain medicine so that he would experience the full agony of the suffering that we deserve. And he stayed up there longer than he had to, so that it would be clear that it was fulfilled. And when he was done, he dismissed his own spirit and chose death himself. And he offers his death to you. Because you deserve death, and I deserve death. The punishment for our sin is eternal death in hell and separation from God. But Jesus died in agony, though he had earned no death, so that that death could be applied to your account. If you will do as the thief on the cross did, you will recognize that you deserve the cross and he doesn't. You will recognize that he is the only Son of God, and you will cry out to rescue. And what we are told is that all who call on the name of the Lord will be saved. And as David prophesied, it has been passed down from generation to generation to those yet unborn, that he has made a way for you and for I. So first, I want to ask, will you accept what he's offered you? Will you accept that forgiveness? Will you accept that death? And if you have already accepted, I want to ask you this. Have you so encapsulated the phrase, Jesus died on the cross, to the point that you have minimized it in your own life? That you don't remember or recognize the sacrifice that was made for you? That you live your life sinning when you feel like it, doing what you want to because you've been forgiven while minimizing the sacrifice that was made for you? If so, let today be a reminder of what was done for you. Would you stand with me? Our Heavenly Father, we come before you right now, and I'm so grateful for the sacrifice. And as I go through this, I cannot even begin to imagine the experience, the pain, the difficulty, or the act of will that was required to turn away relief in the midst of this. But I look at what you accomplished and how you intervened for us, and I'm grateful and I'm sorry. I'm grateful, Lord, that you've done this, but I'm so sorry for the way that I minimize it, for the way that I don't take it seriously, for the way that I don't live in light of what you've done. And I ask not that I would sit in the agony of the cross, Lord, but that I would not reduce it to something that's manageable, something that's not that big of a deal, something that you did for me and I'm grateful for, but I'm going to go ahead and do my own thing. And I ask, Lord, that if there is any here today who has not accepted the death that you've offered on their behalf, that they would recognize that if they don't accept the death you are offering, they will have to pay their own. And though 3 days later you came back to life and offer that same resurrection to all those who accept that death, they have no way to resurrect themselves. That once they suffer that punishment, they will spend the rest of eternity separated from you. And I ask that they would call out to you today for forgiveness. It's in Jesus' name I pray these things, Lord. Amen. We call this an invitation. It's a time of response. It's a time for you to deal with God. Whatever it is that He's saying to you, deal with it. Don't let it pass, but deal with it now as we sing.